The sound of splitting wood echoed through the crisp Montana morning, but it wasn't the steady rhythm of a man's axe. Sarah Jameson's hands were blistered and raw as she struggled with the heavy tool, her slender frame shaking with each attempted swing. The bitter November wind of 1876 cut through her threadbare shawl, but she couldn't stop. Winter was coming, and without firewood, she and her young son wouldn't survive. Sarah wiped her brow with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her face. 6 months a widow, and each day seemed harder than the last. The small homestead that had once held so much promise now felt like a prison of endless labor and loneliness. Her husband Thomas had been a good man, not perfect by any means, but steady and kind. The influenza that took him had been swift and merciless, leaving her alone with 5-year-old Matthew and a farm she could barely maintain. She positioned another log on the chopping block, raising the axe with trembling arms. The weight of it nearly pulled her backward, and her strike landed awkwardly, barely splintering the wood. Tears of frustration stung her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't put food on the table or keep the cabin warm. "Madam," a deep voice called from behind her. "Might I offer some assistance?" Sarah whirled around, startled by the sudden presence. She hadn't heard anyone approach, which spoke to her exhaustion more than anything else. Standing by the fence line was a tall man astride a chestnut mare. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered with several days' worth of stubble. "I don't need charity," she said reflexively, gripping the axe handle tighter despite the burning in her palms. The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. "Not offering charity, madam. Just seems a waste to let good wood sit uncut when I've got 2 strong arms not doing much at the moment." He stepped closer, and Sarah took an instinctive step back. Living alone had taught her caution, especially with drifters. But this man didn't have the hard, desperate look of the usual travelers who pass through. His clothes were worn but clean, his posture straight despite the obvious weariness in his eyes. "Name's Blake Thompson," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Just passing through on my way north. Saw you struggling with that load earlier when you were bringing it from the woods." Sarah glanced toward the half-empty woodshed, then back at the stranger Blake. His eyes were a clear blue that reminded her of summer skies, a stark contrast to his sun-darkened skin. "Sarah Jameson," she finally replied, lowering the axe slightly. "My son and I manage just fine, Mr. Thompson." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "No doubt you do, Mrs. Jameson. But there's managing and then there's thriving. Everyone needs a helping hand now and again." Before she could protest further, he stepped forward and gently took the axe from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, warm despite the chill in the air. Sarah noticed calluses that spoke of hard work not unlike her late husband's hands. "I can offer you a meal for your trouble," she said reluctantly, "but nothing more." Blake positioned a log on the chopping block. "A meal would be more than fair." He split the wood with one clean stroke, the halves falling neatly to either side. Sarah couldn't help but watch the controlled power in his movements as he worked through the pile faster than she could have in an entire day. There was an efficiency to him, nothing wasted, nothing showy. "Where are you headed?" she asked after a while, gathering the split pieces into her apron to carry to the woodshed. "Thought I might try my luck in the gold fields up Montana way," he replied, pausing to wipe his brow. "Though I've heard the best claims are already staked." "Most men who pass through here saying the same came back poorer than when they left," Sarah commented. Blake laughed, a warm sound that seemed to lighten the air around them. "I don't doubt it. But a man needs purpose, Mrs. Jameson, even if it's just chasing a dream for a while." As they worked together to move the split wood, Sarah found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably not yet 30, but there was a weathered quality to him that suggested he'd seen his share of hardship. Unlike many drifters, he worked without complaint, stacking the wood with care rather than simply tossing it. "Ma," a small voice called out, and Sarah turned to see Matthew running from the cabin, his dark hair tousled by the wind. "Matthew James Jameson, I told you to stay inside and mind your lessons," she scolded, though there was no real heat in her words. The boy skidded to a stop when he noticed Blake, his eyes widening with curiosity. "Who are you, Mr. Matthew?" Sarah admonished. "Mind your manners." Blake crouched down to the boy's level, his smile gentle. "Blake Thompson, at your service, young sir. I'm helping your ma with some wood chopping." Matthew seemed to consider this seriously before nodding. "Pa used to chop the wood. He was real strong." A flash of pain crossed Sarah's face, but she kept her composure. "Yes, he was. Now go back inside and finish your reading. I'll be in shortly to start dinner." Once Matthew had reluctantly returned to the cabin, Sarah turned back to Blake, expecting to see pity in his eyes. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that caught her off guard. "He seems like a fine boy," Blake said simply. "He is," Sarah agreed, feeling a surge of pride despite her weariness. "Smart as a whip and stubborn as a mule, much like his father." Blake nodded, returning to his work. They fell into a companionable silence, the rhythm of the axe punctuating the quiet afternoon. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the woodshed was nearly full, and Sarah's anxiety about the approaching winter had eased somewhat. "That should last you a good while," Blake said, leaning the axe against the chopping block. "Especially if you keep the fires banked at night." Sarah looked at the neatly stacked woodpile, overwhelmed by what would have taken her weeks to accomplish alone. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Mr. Thompson." "Blake," he corrected gently. "And you already offered thanks in the form of a meal, which I'm hoping still stands. Been living on trail, beans, and jerky for longer than I care to admit." Sarah couldn't help but smile at his hopeful expression. "The offer stands. It's nothing fancy, just rabbit stew and cornbread, but it's hot." "Sounds like a feast to me," Blake replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. As they walked toward the cabin, Blake paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Mrs. Jameson, Sarah, I know it's not my place, but a woman and child alone out here. It's a hard road." Sarah stiffened. "We manage." "No doubt," he said quickly. "But winter's coming on fast. Might be you could use an extra pair of hands around here, at least until spring." The proposition hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Sarah wasn't ready to consider. "Mr. Thompson, just hear me out," he interrupted gently. "I'm handy with tools, good with livestock, and I don't mind hard work. I'm not asking for anything improper. I can bunk in your barn, help with the heavy chores. In return, just meals and a roof over my head." Sarah studied him, searching for any sign of deceit or ulterior motives. All she saw was earnestness, and perhaps a touch of loneliness that mirrored her own. "Why would you do that? Give up your plans for the gold fields to help strangers?" Blake looked toward the setting sun, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe I'm tired of chasing what might never be there. Maybe what's right in front of me seems more worthwhile." He turned back to her, and in that moment, with the golden light casting long shadows across the yard, Sarah felt something shift inside her, a door opening that she'd thought permanently closed. "Share your life with me," he said softly, the words less a question than a statement of simple truth. "Even if just for a season, let me help you carry this load." Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she led the way into the cabin, where Matthew was sitting at the rough-hewn table, laboriously forming letters on a slate. The domestic scene, warm and ordinary, felt suddenly precious, something worth protecting at all costs. "We'll discuss it after supper," she finally said, meeting Blake's eyes. "I make no promises, Mr. Thompson." Blake nodded, understanding the caution in her response. "Fair enough, and it's still Blake." Sarah smiled despite herself. "Blake then." As she moved about the small cabin, preparing their meal, Sarah was acutely aware of his presence. It had been so long since a man's voice had filled these walls, since Matthew had looked at someone with the open curiosity he now directed at Blake. The stranger asked the boy about his studies, listening with genuine interest to Matthew's excited explanations of what he was learning. By the time they sat down to eat, the tension in Sarah's shoulders had eased somewhat. She watched as Blake bowed his head for a brief, silent grace before tasting the stew, his appreciation evident in his expression. "This might be the best meal I've had in years, Mrs. Jameson," he said sincerely. "Sarah," she corrected, surprising herself. "If I'm to call you Blake, it's only fair." A smile spread across his face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made her pulse quicken. "Sarah it is, then." The conversation flowed easily through the meal, Blake sharing stories of his travels that had Matthew wide-eyed with wonder. He spoke of buffalo herds that darkened the plains, of mountains so tall they seemed to touch the heavens, and of people from all corners of the world seeking their fortunes. "Have you ever shot a real outlaw, Mr. Blake?" Matthew asked excitedly. "Matthew," Sarah admonished. Blake chuckled. "It's all right. And no, young man, I haven't. Truth be told, most outlaws I've encountered were just men down on their luck who made poor choices. Real life isn't like those dime novels. But you carry a gun," Matthew pointed out, gesturing to the holster at Blake's hip. "I do," Blake acknowledged, his tone growing serious. "Out here, it's often necessary for hunting and protection. But a man should never draw a weapon unless he has no other choice. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude for his measured response. It was the kind of lesson Thomas would have wanted their son to learn, a perspective on manhood that valued wisdom over brute force. After dinner, when Matthew had been tucked into bed with a short story from Blake about a clever rabbit outsmarting a wolf, Sarah found herself sitting across from the cowboy at the table, a cup of coffee warming her hands. "He's taken quite a shine to you," she observed. Blake's expression softened. "He's a good boy. Smart, like you said. Reminds me a bit of myself at that age, full of questions about everything under the sun." "And were your questions answered?" Sarah asked, curious about the man who had so unexpectedly entered their lives. A shadow passed over Blake's features. "Some were. My father wasn't a patient man, but my mother, she had a way of explaining things that made sense of the world." "Are they still living?" Blake shook his head. "Lost them both in '67. Cholera swept through our settlement in Kansas. I was 17. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly, recognizing the familiar pain in his voice. "It's not easy being left behind." "No," he agreed, meeting her eyes. "It isn't. Is that what happened with your husband?" Sarah nodded, her throat tightening. "Thomas took ill last spring. The doctor said it was influenza, but it moved to his lungs. He was gone within a week." Blake reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "I can't imagine how difficult that's been, especially with a young one depending on you." "We've managed," Sarah said, the phrase feeling like a talisman she clung to. "But I won't lie, it's been hard. Thomas and we had dreams for this place. A proper farm, maybe even hiring help someday. Now I'm just trying to hold on to what we have." "And you're doing it," Blake said, his admiration evident. "But you don't have to do it alone." The offer hung between them again, impossible to ignore. Sarah studied him in the soft lamplight, trying to reconcile the caution that had kept her and Matthew safe with the instinct that told her Blake Thompson was a man she could trust. "If you stayed," she said carefully, "there would have to be rules, proper boundaries." Blake nodded seriously. Of course. The barn has a small room where our hired hand used to stay back when we could afford one. It's not much, but it's dry and has a stove. Sounds like luxury compared to sleeping under the stars with one eye open, Blake said with a smile. Sarah continued, I can offer room and board in exchange for help with the farm work, but I want to be clear I'm not looking for anything else. Blake's expression remained respectful. I understand completely. I'm offering my hands for work, nothing more. Though I hope we might become friends in time. Something in his direct gaze made Sarah believe him, despite all the reasons experience had taught her to be wary. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Thompson, until spring at least. Blake extended his hand across the table. Until spring. Sarah hesitated only briefly before taking it, his calloused palm warm against hers. The simple contact sent an unexpected flutter through her chest, something she quickly attributed to relief at having help for the winter months ahead. I'll get my things from my horse and settle in, Blake said, rising from the table. And tomorrow, we can take stock of what needs doing before the snow flies. As he stepped out into the night, Sarah remained at the table, wondering if she'd just made the wisest decision of her life or the most foolish. Either way, she couldn't deny the sense of hope that had taken root alongside her apprehension, the first real hope she'd felt since placing flowers on Thomas's grave. Outside, Blake led his horse toward the barn, his own thoughts in turmoil. He hadn't planned on stopping, let alone staying. The gold fields had been calling him for months, a chance to finally make something of himself after years of drifting. But something about the sight of Sarah struggling with that load of firewood had reached inside him, awakening a protective instinct he'd thought long buried. He hadn't lied about his intentions, he truly didn't expect anything beyond what they'd agreed to. But as he settled his horse in a stall and carried his meager belongings to the small room at the back of the barn, Blake couldn't deny that Sarah Jameson had stirred something in him. Her quiet strength, the dignity with which she faced her hardships, the love that shone in her eyes when she looked at her son, all of it had affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. Just until spring, he reminded himself, lighting the small stove to take the chill off the room. Just lending a hand where it's needed. But as he stretched out on the narrow cot, listening to the wind rising outside, Blake Thompson wondered if he was finally where he was meant to be all along. The first week established a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Blake rose before dawn, tending to the livestock before Sarah even emerged from the cabin. She would find the chicken coop already mucked out, fresh water in the troughs, and often Blake halfway through some repair she'd been putting off for lack of time or strength. You don't have to do everything at once, she told him on the third morning, finding him replacing rotted boards on the barn's eastern wall. We've managed with things as they are, Blake hammered in another nail before answering. Just because you can manage doesn't mean you should have to. Besides, better to fix things now than wait for them to fail completely. Sarah couldn't argue with his logic, nor could she deny the relief of seeing long-neglected tasks finally being addressed. The property was already looking more cared for than it had in months, and she found herself sleeping better at night knowing the roof wouldn't leak and the livestock were secure. Matthew took to Blake immediately, following him around whenever Sarah allowed it, peppering him with questions about everything from how to track animals to why the sky was blue. Blake answered with patience, often turning the boy's questions into impromptu lessons about nature, mathematics, or practical skills. You're good with him, Sarah observed one evening as they sat on the porch after Matthew had gone to bed. The nights were growing colder, but they'd taken to sharing this quiet time each evening, watching the stars emerge. Blake looked thoughtful. He makes it easy, eager to learn, that one. He hasn't had much male attention since Thomas passed, Sarah said softly. I worry about that sometimes him growing up without a father's guidance. You're doing right by him, Blake assured her. And boys can grow into good men with just a mother's love. My best friend growing up was raised by his ma after his pa was killed in a mining accident. He turned out to be the finest man I've known. Sarah appreciated his words, but they also heightened her awareness of how quickly Matthew was becoming attached to Blake. I just don't want him hurt when you move on in the spring. Blake was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. I understand. I'll be careful not to make promises I can't keep. The conversation shifted to plans for the coming week. There was a section of fence that needed mending, and Blake had noticed signs that the root cellar might not stay dry through winter without some work. Simple, practical matters that filled the space between them with purpose, rather than the more complicated feelings that sometimes flickered in their shared glances. As October gave way to November, the work continued. They dug potatoes from the garden and stored them carefully in the root cellar. Blake hunted deer, bringing home meat that Sarah preserved for the winter months. Together they repaired the chicken coop, gathered the last of the fall apples, and prepared the small farm for the coming snow. Their first real test came with an early blizzard that swept down from the mountains without warning. The wind howled through the night, rattling the cabin's windows and piling snow against its walls. Sarah woke to find Blake already outside, creating paths to the barn and chicken coop, his broad shoulders bent against the driving snow. She bundled Matthew up and kept him inside, watching through frosted windows as Blake fought to ensure the animals were fed and watered. When he finally stumbled back into the cabin hours later, his face was raw from the cold, his clothes crusted with ice. The stock is fine, he reported, removing his snow-covered coat and boots by the door. Had to dig the chicken coop door out completely, it was drifted shut. But everyone's fed and as comfortable as can be expected. Sarah handed him a cup of hot coffee, their fingers brushing in the exchange. You're half frozen. Sit by the fire before you catch your death. Blake didn't argue, sinking gratefully into the chair nearest the hearth. Matthew immediately climbed onto the arm of the chair, eager to hear about Blake's battle with the storm. Was it scary out there, Mr. Blake? The boy asked, eyes wide. Respect-worthy is what it was, Blake answered, warming his hands around the coffee cup. Nature reminds us sometimes just how small we are, but that's why we prepare so we can weather whatever comes our way. Sarah brought him a bowl of hot stew, watching as some color returned to his face. Something had shifted between them during these weeks of shared work and quiet evenings. The careful distance she'd maintained had begun to erode, replaced by a comfortable familiarity that both comforted and unsettled her. That night, after Matthew was asleep, Sarah found herself unable to rest. The storm continued to rage outside, and her thoughts were as turbulent as the weather. She rose from bed and wrapped a shawl around her nightdress, intending to check that the fire in the main room hadn't died completely. She was surprised to find Blake still awake, sitting at the table with a small notebook open before him. He looked up at her entrance, closing the book with a gentle motion. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice low so as not to wake Matthew in the small side room. Sarah shook her head. The wind. It always sounds like it's trying to tear the roof off. The cabin's solid, Blake assured her. Your husband built it well. The mention of Thomas didn't bring the sharp pain it once had. Instead, Sarah felt a quiet gratitude for what he'd given her, mixed with an awareness of how her life was continuing beyond his loss. What were you writing? She asked, nodding toward the notebook Blake had closed. A hint of color touched his cheeks. Just thoughts. Been keeping a journal since I was young. My mother thought it important for a man to know his own mind. She sounds wise, Sarah said, sitting across from him. She was, Blake agreed. Taught school before she married my father. Always had a book nearby, even when times were hard. Sarah studied him in the low lamplight, seeing beyond the capable cowboy to the man beneath thoughtful, observant, more complex than she'd initially assumed. What did you do before you started drifting west? Blake's expression grew distant. Bit of everything. Worked cattle mostly. Did a stint as a deputy in a small Kansas town, but found I didn't have the stomach for locking men up. Tried my hand at trading, freight hauling, even prospecting for a season. A man of many talents, Sarah observed. Jack of all trades, master of none, Blake corrected with a self-deprecating smile. Never could seem to settle on just one path. And yet you're very settled in what you do here, Sarah pointed out. You work this land as if it were your own. The observation hung between them, loaded with unspoken possibility. Blake met her gaze directly. It's good land, worth caring for, worth protecting. Sarah felt her heart quicken at the intensity in his blue eyes. Blake, he held up a hand gently. I know what we agreed. I'm not presuming anything, Sarah. But I want you to know that being here, helping you and Matthew, it's given me purpose in a way that chasing gold never could. The honesty in his voice touched something deep within her, a longing she tried to bury alongside her husband. I'm grateful you stopped that day, she said softly. More than I can properly express. Blake reached across the table, his hand open in invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah placed her hand in his. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through her, a connection that transcended words. We should try to get some rest, she said eventually, reluctantly withdrawing her hand. Morning comes early, storm or no storm. Blake nodded, respecting her retreat. Sleep well, Sarah. As she returned to her bed, Sarah's mind was filled not with the howling wind, but with the gentle strength of Blake's hand holding hers, and the look in his eyes that had spoken of possibilities she'd thought forever closed to her. The storm passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. The days grew shorter, the nights colder, but the Jameson homestead stood warm against winter's advance. Blake continued to prove his worth, not just in the physical labor he contributed, but in the 100 small ways he eased their lives, teaching Matthew to whittle, surprising Sarah with repairs to household items she hadn't even mentioned needed fixing, ensuring there was always water drawn and wood chopped before she had to ask. As Christmas approached, Sarah noticed Blake becoming more secretive, disappearing into the barn for hours at a time when his chores were done. Matthew seemed equally mysterious, giggling behind his hands whenever she questioned what he and Blake discussed during their time together. A week before Christmas, Blake announced he needed to make a trip into town for supplies. Anything you need while I'm there, he asked, saddling his horse early in the morning. Sarah handed him a small list: coffee, sugar, maybe some peppermint sticks for Matthew if they weren't too dear. Nothing urgent. The pantry is well stocked thanks to your hunting. Blake nodded, tucking the list into his coat pocket. I should be back by nightfall. Weather looks clear, but if it turns, don't worry. I'd sooner wait in town than risk the horse on bad roads. Sarah found herself unnecessarily adjusting his scarf, her hands lingering near his collar. Be careful. His eyes softened at her concern. Always am. Keep the rifle handy just in case, but I don't expect any trouble. She watched him ride away, the sun glinting off the snow in diamond bright flashes. The property felt emptier without his presence, a fact that both surprised and unsettled her. In just 2 months, Blake Thompson had become essential to their lives in ways that went far beyond the physical help he provided. That evening, when Blake hadn't returned by sunset, Sarah tried not to worry. The winter days were short, and the road to town often took longer than expected when covered in snow. She kept dinner warm, distracting Matthew with stories and simple games, but as the hours passed, her concern grew. "Is Mr. Blake lost, Ma?" Matthew asked as she tucked him into bed, much later than his usual time. "No, sweetheart," Sarah assured him, smoothing his dark hair. "The town's probably just busy with Christmas coming. He'll be here when you wake up." Matthew yawned, his eyelids growing heavy. "He promised to help me with my present for you. It's a secret." Sarah smiled, kissing his forehead. "Then I won't ask about it. Sleep now." After Matthew drifted off, Sarah found herself pacing the cabin, checking the window every few minutes despite the darkness that made seeing anything beyond the yard impossible. When she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching, the relief that flooded through her was so intense it left her trembling. Blake stamped the snow from his boots at the door, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. "Sorry I'm so late. Got delayed in town, and then the northern road had drifted over. Had to take the long way round." Sarah realized she was staring at him, drinking in the sight of him safe and whole. "I kept some stew warm," she said, turning quickly to hide the emotion on her face. Blake hung his coat by the door, watching her with a thoughtful expression. "Were you worried?" "Matthew was," she deflected, busying herself with ladling stew into a bowl. "He was afraid you'd miss helping with whatever secret project you two are planning." Blake accepted the bowl with a grateful nod, but his eyes remained on her face. "And you, Sarah? Were you concerned for my welfare?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. Sarah met his gaze, finding herself unwilling to hide behind politeness. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I was worried." Something shifted in Blake's expression, a softening, a certainty. He set the bowl aside untouched and took a step toward her. "I'll always come back to you, Sarah, as long as you want me to." The promise in his words made her breath catch. They stood facing each other in the warm kitchen, the distance between them charged with unspoken feeling. Sarah wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly Blake's arms were around her, and she was pressing her face against his chest, breathing in the cold outdoor air that clung to his clothes, and the familiar scent that was uniquely him. "I didn't know what we would do if something happened to you," she whispered against his shirt. Blake's hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his touch infinitely gentle. "Nothing's going to happen to me, and even if it did, you'd manage. You're the strongest woman I've ever known." Sarah looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were, how intimate this embrace had become. "Blake, I know," he said, understanding in his eyes. "Too soon. Too complicated. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, Sarah." He started to step back, but Sarah found herself unwilling to break the connection between them. Her hands tightened on his arms. "I'm not sure what I'm ready for," she admitted. "But I know I don't want you to go." Blake's expression grew serious. "I made a promise until spring. I won't break my word." "And after spring?" Sarah asked, the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for weeks. His eyes held hers, clear and honest. "That depends on what you want, Sarah, what you and Matthew need." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then, with a gentleness that made her heart ache, Blake leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture of affection that carefully respected the boundaries they'd established. "Your stew's getting cold," Sarah said, her voice unsteady as she stepped back. Blake smiled, the tension easing. "And it smells too good to waste." They returned to safer ground, Blake telling her about his trip to town, the preparations for the Christmas social at the church, the news he'd heard about cattle prices and weather predictions for the winter. But something had changed between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that could no longer be ignored. That night, lying in her bed, Sarah touched her fingers to the spot where Blake's lips had pressed against her skin. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that included love again, a future with Blake Thompson in it, not just as a hired hand, but as something more. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. Matthew woke early, his excitement palpable as he bounded into Sarah's room. "Ma, it's Christmas. Can we see if Mr. Blake is awake yet?" Sarah laughed, pulling on her robe. "Let's at least get the fire going and put the coffee on first. Mr. Blake deserves a few more minutes of sleep." But Blake was already at the door when they opened it, his arms full of firewood, a grin spreading across his face at the sight of Matthew's joy. "Merry Christmas, young man. Looks like you're ready to start the celebrating." The morning passed in a flurry of simple but heartfelt traditions. Sarah had baked special cinnamon bread the night before, and Blake contributed a pot of honey he'd purchased in town. Matthew received a new slate and pencils for his studies, a wooden top Blake had carved for him, and a picture book Sarah had saved for months to buy. "Now our present for Ma," Matthew announced after opening his gifts, looking to Blake with conspiratoria excitement. Blake nodded solemnly. "Go get it from my coat pocket. Carefully now." Matthew raced to Blake's coat hanging by the door and returned with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He presented it to Sarah with obvious pride. "Me and Mr. Blake made it together." Sarah unwrapped the package slowly, aware of both Matthew's anticipation and Blake's watchful gaze. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden box, its lid inlaid with a simple but elegant design of a rose. "Open it, Ma," Matthew urged. Sarah lifted the lid to find the inside lined with soft fabric. Nestled within was a delicate silver locket on a fine chain. Her breath caught as she carefully removed it. "It was my mother's," Blake said quietly. "One of the few things I kept after she passed. Matthew and I thought you should have something special for Christmas." Sarah looked up at him, too moved to speak immediately. The gift was intensely personal, far more than their arrangement warranted. "Blake, I can't accept this. It's a family heirloom." "Which is why I want you to have it," he said, his meaning clear in his steady gaze. "My mother would approve." Matthew was bouncing with excitement. "Open the locket, Ma. That's the part I helped with." With trembling fingers, Sarah worked the tiny clasp. Inside the locket was a miniature drawing a small, perfect sketch of Matthew's face, rendered with surprising skill. "Mr. Blake drew it, but I sat really still," Matthew explained proudly. "Do you like it?" Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received," she said honestly. "Both of you. Thank you." Blake moved to her side, taking the necklace gently from her hands. "May I?" Sarah nodded, turning so he could fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin as he worked the clasp, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "I have something for you too," she said when he'd finished, reaching beneath the small tree to retrieve a package she'd hidden there. "It's not nearly as fine as what you've given me, but—" Blake unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "Sarah, this is beautiful. When did you find time to make this?" "Late nights," she admitted. "After you and Matthew were asleep." He ran his fingers over the even stitches, his expression one of genuine appreciation. "No one's made something for me by hand since my mother. Thank you." He wrapped the scarf around his neck immediately, the blue bringing out the color of his eyes. Sarah felt a rush of pleasure at seeing him wear her gift, at knowing her hands had created something that would keep him warm. The day continued with a special dinner, games and stories by the fire. As darkness fell, Blake produced a fiddle Sarah hadn't known he possessed and filled the cabin with lively tunes that had Matthew dancing around the room, and slower, sweeter melodies that seemed to speak directly to Sarah's heart. When Matthew finally succumbed to exhaustion and was tucked into bed, Sarah and Blake sat together before the fire, the cabin quiet except for the occasional pop and crackle of burning wood. "This has been the happiest day I've had in a very long time," Sarah said softly, her fingers absently touching the locket around her neck. Blake set his fiddle aside. For me as well. Thank you for sharing your Christmas with me. You've become part of it, Sarah said simply. Part of us. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Blake's eyes reflected the firelight as he studied her face. Sarah, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about it for weeks now. Sarah felt her heart quicken. What is it? When spring comes, he began carefully, I don't want to leave, not unless you ask me to go. Sarah's breath caught. Blake, please let me finish, he said gently. I know it hasn't been long, I know you're still healing from losing Thomas, but these months with you and Matthew, they've shown me what I want in life, what matters. He took her hand in his touch warm and steady. I'm not asking for promises right now. I'm just asking you to consider a future where I stay not as your hired hand, but as a man who cares deeply for you and your son. A man who wants to build something lasting here with you. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, emotions washing through her in overwhelming waves. Part of her wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of her grief and independence. But a stronger part, a part that had been awakening slowly since the day Blake first took that load of firewood from her arms, recognized the truth in his words and in her own heart. I'm afraid, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Of what? Blake asked, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. Sarah met his eyes. Of losing again, of opening my heart and having it broken. Blake nodded, understanding in his gaze. Life offers no guarantees, Sarah. I can't promise that pain won't find us again. But I can promise to face whatever comes beside you, for as long as you'll have me. In the firelight, with the Christmas tree casting soft shadows across the room and the weight of Blake's hand warm in hers, Sarah made her choice. She leaned forward slowly, giving him time to understand her intention, and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Blake responded with equal tenderness, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with a reverence that made her heart swell. When they finally parted, Sarah felt as though something essential had shifted within her, a corner turned, a new path revealed. I'm not ready to make any grand decisions tonight, she said softly. But I do know that when spring comes, I don't want you to leave either. The smile that spread across Blake's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm and full of promise. Then I'll stay, Sarah, for as long as you'll have me. He sealed the promise with another kiss, this one deeper, a confirmation of the connection growing between them. As the fire burned low and the Christmas night wrapped around the small cabin, Sarah Jameson allowed herself to believe in second chances and the unexpected gift of love that had arrived with a man who'd simply stopped to help her carry firewood. The weeks following Christmas brought heavy snows that blanketed the countryside, turning the Jameson homestead into an island amidst a sea of white. Blake moved his few belongings from the barn room to the small storage space off the main cabin, close enough to help with the cabin's upkeep, but still maintaining the propriety that Sarah insisted upon for Matthew's sake, and the neighbors who occasionally managed to visit, despite the weather. January passed in a rhythm of work and quiet evenings, the three of them settling into a routine that felt increasingly like family. Blake taught Matthew to play checkers and simple card games, read to him from the few books in the cabin, and began teaching him the fundamentals of woodworking. Sarah watched their bond deepen, her initial concerns about Matthew becoming too attached gradually replaced by gratitude for the male guidance Blake provided. Her own relationship with Blake evolved in more subtle ways. Stolen moments when Matthew was occupied or asleep, a lingering touch as they passed each other in the kitchen, conversations by the fire that stretched late into the night, occasional kisses that grew more confident as Sarah's reservations slowly melted away. Tell me about Thomas, Blake said one evening in early February as they sat side by side on the small sofa, a rare moment alone while Matthew was already asleep. The question surprised Sarah. Most men, she thought, would avoid any mention of a predecessor, especially one still held in affection. "You want to know about my husband?" Blake nodded, his expression open. "He was an important part of your life, the father of your son. I'd like to understand who he was." Sarah studied him for a moment, appreciating the generosity of spirit behind the request. "Thomas was a dreamer," she began, memories washing over her with less pain than before. "Always had big plans for this place, orchards, more livestock, maybe even hiring several hands eventually. He could build anything with his hands, but numbers gave him trouble. I kept the books." She smiled at a particular memory. "He once traded 3 months of carpentry work in town for that piano," she said, nodding toward the small upright against the wall. "Even though neither of us could play more than Camptown races, he said every proper home needed music." "He sounds like a good man," Blake said sincerely. "He was," Sarah agreed. "Not perfect, he could be stubborn as a mule when he got an idea in his head, and he had a temper when things didn't go as planned. But he loved Matthew and me fiercely, protected us. Worked himself to exhaustion for this place." Blake took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "Thank you for telling me about him." Sarah looked up, touched by his understanding. Most men wouldn't want to hear about a woman's previous husband. "I'm not most men," Blake said simply. "And Thomas helped make you who you are today, the woman I've come to care for deeply." The directness of his words sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest. In the months since Blake's arrival, he had never pressured her, never pushed for definitions or commitments beyond what she was ready to give. His patience had allowed her feelings to develop naturally, without the complication of guilt or obligation. "What about you?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Has there been anyone special in your past?" Blake's expression grew thoughtful. "There was a girl back in Kansas before my parents died, Mary Callahan. We had an understanding, or thought we did." "What happened?" "Life," Blake said with a shrug that didn't quite hide the old hurt. "After my parents passed, I had nothing to offer except a young man's dreams and ambitions. Her father had more practical concerns for his daughter's future. Last I heard, she married a banker from Topeka." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Blake replied, his eyes clear as they met hers. "If things had gone differently with Mary, I wouldn't be here now, with you." The simple truth of his statement hung in the air between them. Sarah found herself leaning toward him, drawn by the warmth in his gaze and the solid presence that had become her anchor through the winter months. Blake met her halfway, his kiss gentle but carrying an undercurrent of deeper feeling that made Sarah's heart race. His hand came up to cradle her face, fingers threading into her hair with tender care. When they parted, Sarah remained close, her forehead resting against his. "Blake," she whispered, his name a question and an answer all at once. "I love you, Sarah," he said quietly, the words simple and unadorned. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you struggling with that firewood, too stubborn to admit you needed help." A small laugh escaped her, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I was rather stubborn, wasn't I? Determined," Blake corrected with a smile. "It's one of the things I admire most about you, your strength, your perseverance." Sarah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. "I didn't expect to find this again. Didn't think I wanted to." Blake's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll spend every day making sure you never regret giving me your heart, Sarah Jameson." As February gave way to March, subtle signs of spring began appearing despite the snow that still covered much of the landscape. Blake started repairs on the fences damaged by winter drifts, and together, they planned the spring planting larger than Sarah had initially thought possible with just her own labor. "We should be able to double the vegetable garden," Blake suggested one evening as they pored over rough sketches of the property. And this field here would be good for corn, I think. Sarah nodded, enjoying the way he said we without hesitation. If the weather holds, we might even manage some wheat in the north section. Their planning was interrupted by a knock at the door, unusual for the time of year when most neighbors stayed close to home. Blake rose to answer it, his hand instinctively checking the position of the pistol he kept nearby out of habit. At the door stood Sheriff Ellis from town, his expression grave beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Evening, Thompson. Mrs. Jameson. Sorry to trouble you so late." "Not at all, Sheriff," Sarah said, coming to stand beside Blake. "Please come in from the cold." The sheriff stepped inside, removing his hat. His eyes moved between Sarah and Blake, noting their proximity with a flicker of interest before his expression returned to business. "I'm afraid I bring troubling news. There's been a series of homestead robberies about 30 miles north of here. 2 families lost everything of value, and 1 man was shot when he tried to resist." Blake's posture stiffened. "Any descriptions of the perpetrators?" "3 men," the sheriff replied. "Led by a fellow named Curtis Blackwell, according to witnesses. Mean customer with a reputation from Texas to Montana. Word is they're working their way south." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You think they might come this way?" Sheriff Ellis shrugged. "Hard to say. They seem to be targeting isolated homesteads, especially those they suspect might have cash or valuables. Just wanted to warn folks to be extra vigilant. Keep doors locked, firearms loaded." "I appreciate the warning," Blake said seriously. "We'll keep a sharp eye out." After the sheriff departed with a promise to send word of any developments, Sarah found herself unusually quiet as they prepared for bed. Blake noticed her silence, coming to stand beside her as she braided her hair for the night. "We'll be fine, Sarah," he assured her. "This place doesn't look prosperous enough to tempt thieves, and I'll make sure we're prepared just in case." Sarah nodded, but worry still creased her brow. "It's not just that. When the sheriff was looking at us, Blake, people will talk about us. About our arrangement." Blake's expression grew serious. "Does that concern you?" "Not for myself," Sarah admitted, "but for Matthew, for how it might affect him if there's gossip." Blake considered this, respect for her concerns evident in his thoughtful silence before he spoke. "Then perhaps it's time we clarified our situation not just for ourselves, but for the community as well." Sarah looked up at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Blake," he took her hands in his gaze steady and certain. "I was planning to wait until spring was properly here, do this right with flowers and such. But maybe there's no perfect time, just the right person." Blake lowered himself to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "Sarah Jameson, I love you. I love Matthew as if he were my own son. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of letting me be a father to your boy and a husband to you for all the days we're granted?" Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, her heart so full it seemed it might burst. This man who had entered their lives by chance, who had proven his worth through actions rather than words, who had patiently allowed her heart to heal and open again, he was offering her a future she'd thought lost forever. "Yes," she whispered, her voice gaining strength as certainty filled her. "Yes, Blake Thompson, I will marry you." Blake rose and gathered her in his arms, his kiss conveying all the joy and promise of their shared future. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "We should tell Matthew in the morning," he suggested. "If that's all right with you." Sarah nodded, happiness radiating through her. "He'll be overjoyed. He already thinks of you as family." That night, as she lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of Blake checking the locks and banking the fire, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The path ahead would have its challenges. She harbored no illusions about that, but facing them with Blake by her side filled her with confidence rather than fear. Matthew's reaction the next morning exceeded even their expectations. When they sat him down after breakfast and Blake formally asked for his blessing to marry his mother, the boy launched himself into Blake's arms with such enthusiasm that he nearly knocked them both over. "Does this mean you're going to be my pa now?" Matthew asked, his small face alight with hope. Blake looked to Sarah, then back to the boy, his expression solemn despite the joy in his eyes. "If you'd like that, yes. I'd be honored to be your pa. But I want you to know something important, Matthew. I'm not trying to replace your father. He'll always be your pa too, and we'll make sure you remember him and the good man he was." Matthew considered this with surprising maturity for his young age. "Ma says pa is watching over us from heaven. I think he'd want us to be happy." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at her son's simple wisdom. "I think so too, sweetheart." Plans for a spring wedding began taking shape. The local minister agreed to perform the ceremony once the roads were clear enough for guests to attend. Sarah started work on a new dress, using fabric she'd been saving for a special occasion, while Blake rode into town to order a proper wedding ring. But their happiness was temporarily overshadowed by continued reports of the robbers moving through the territory. 2 more homesteads had been hit, one just 15 miles away. Blake took to carrying his pistol at all times and insisted on teaching Sarah how to use the shotgun more effectively. "I don't like frightening you," he told her as they practiced behind the barn, "but I need to know you can protect yourself and Matthew if necessary." Sarah understood the practicality of his concern. Life on the frontier required self-reliance and preparedness for all contingencies. Still, the need for such precautions cast a shadow over their wedding preparations. One evening in late March, as a spring storm lashed rain against the windows, Blake sat at the table cleaning his pistol while Sarah mended by the fire. Matthew had been asleep for hours. The combination of helping Blake with spring preparations and his own excitement about the upcoming wedding having tired him thoroughly. "I've been thinking," Blake said, his voice deliberately casual as he reassembled the weapon. "After we're married, maybe we should consider a trip east. Visit some of the bigger towns, perhaps even as far as St. Louis." Sarah looked up from her mending, surprised. That would be quite an undertaking. What brought this on? Blake carefully avoided her gaze, focusing on his task. "Just thinking it might be good for Matthew to see more of the world. Educational." "Blake Thompson," Sarah said, setting her sewing aside. "You're a terrible liar. This is about those robbers, isn't it?" Blake sighed, finally meeting her eyes. "Partly. Sheriff Ellis told me they hit the Peterson place yesterday. Mrs. Peterson was badly roughed up when she couldn't tell them where their savings were hidden." Sarah felt a chill run through her. The Petersons were good people, their homestead not unlike her own. Were they caught? "No," Blake admitted grimly. "But they left a clear trail heading this direction. The sheriff's forming a posse, but they might reach us first," Sarah finished for him, understanding his concern. Blake nodded, his expression troubled. "I'd feel better if you and Matthew were safely in town until this is resolved." Sarah considered his request, appreciating his concern but reluctant to abandon their home. "When is the posse riding out?" "Tomorrow, weather permitting. I told Ellis I'd join them." Sarah stood abruptly. "You're joining the posse. When were you planning to tell me this?" Blake rose as well, his expression apologetic but determined. "I was going to discuss it with you tonight. Sarah, I have experience tracking men like these. I can help. And if something happens to you—" Sarah demanded, fear making her voice sharper than intended. "What then, Blake? We're supposed to be married in 2 weeks." "Nothing's going to happen to me," Blake assured her, moving to take her hands. "But I can't sit by while these men threaten our community, threaten you and Matthew. I need to do this, Sarah." Sarah wanted to argue further, but she recognized the resolve in his eyes. It was one of the qualities she loved about him, his sense of responsibility, his willingness to stand for what was right. Still, the fear of losing him just when they'd found happiness together clutched at her heart. "Promise me you'll be careful," she finally said, her anger giving way to concern. "Promise me you'll come back to us." Blake drew her into his arms, holding her close. "I promise. Nothing could keep me from returning to you and Matthew. We have a future to build together." Sarah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I'll take Matthew to town tomorrow, stay with Mrs. Collins until it's safe. But I expect you back in one piece, Blake Thompson. We have a wedding to attend." Blake's laugh rumbled beneath her ear. "Yes, madam. I wouldn't dare disappoint the bride." The next morning dawned clear after the storm, the world washed clean and bright with early spring sunshine. Blake helped Sarah pack essentials for her stay in town, his movements efficient but his eyes frequently seeking hers, as if memorizing her face. Matthew was excited about the unexpected trip to town, oblivious to the real reason behind it. "Can I visit the general store, Ma? Mr. Williams always has those striped candies." "We'll see," Sarah replied, forcing a smile despite the worry gnawing at her. "Now go make sure your slate and books are packed. Mrs. Collins will expect you to keep up with your studies." When Matthew had scampered off to gather his things, Sarah turned to find Blake watching her with an expression that made her heart tighten. Without a word, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, his kiss desperate and deep, as if he was trying to convey everything he felt in that single moment. "I love you," he said when they finally parted. "You and Matthew are everything to me." Sarah reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that sun and weather had etched around his eyes. "Come back to us, Blake. That's all I ask." He nodded, pressing a final kiss to her palm before stepping back. "The wagon's ready. I'll drive you to town before meeting the posse at the sheriff's office." The journey to town was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon bounced along the muddy spring road. Matthew chattered occasionally, pointing out early wildflowers or asking questions about the wedding, but even he seemed to sense the tension between the adults. Mrs. Collins, a widow whose husband had been the town's doctor before his passing, welcomed them warmly to her comfortable home near the church. "You'll be quite safe here," she assured Sarah, her kind eyes understanding more than was said. "And Blake, Sheriff Ellis was asking after you just an hour ago, said the posse is gathering at noon." Blake nodded his thanks, then crouched to Matthew's level. "You mind your mother while I'm gone, you hear, and keep practicing those knots I showed you. I'll check your progress when I get back." Matthew threw his arms around Blake's neck. "You're coming back soon, right? Ma says we need to make sure everything's ready for the wedding." Blake's arms tightened around the boy. "That's right. Can't keep my bride waiting, can I? I'll be back before you know it." Sarah walked Blake to the door, her composure threatening to break as the moment of parting arrived. "3 days," she said, fixing him with a stern look that didn't quite hide her fear. "If you're not back in 3 days, I'm sending the minister after you." Blake's laugh was genuine despite the circumstances. "Wouldn't want to face Reverend Simmons's wrath. I'll be back, Sarah, with this business concluded so we can start our life together properly." One last kiss, brief but filled with promise, and then he was gone, striding toward the sheriff's office with the purposeful gait that had first caught her attention all those months ago when he'd appeared at her homestead. Sarah watched until he disappeared around a corner, then returned to Mrs. Collins's parlor where Matthew was already engrossed in a picture book the older woman had provided. "Come, dear," Mrs. Collins said kindly. "I've just put the kettle on. A cup of tea will do you good." The next 3 days were among the longest of Sarah's life. She kept Matthew occupied with visits to the general store, the small town library, and the schoolhouse, where he would begin attending in the fall. But her thoughts constantly returned to Blake and the dangerous task he'd undertaken. News trickled in sporadically. The posse had picked up the robbers' trail heading southeast. They'd found an abandoned camp with evidence of recent occupation. A homesteader reported seeing 3 men matching the descriptions riding hard toward the territorial border. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Sarah was helping Mrs. Collins prepare dinner when they heard horses approaching at speed. She rushed to the window, her heart in her throat, to see the posse returning mud-splattered, weary men on equally exhausted horses. Blake was not among them. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the windowsill to steady herself as Sheriff Ellis dismounted and approached Mrs. Collins's house, his expression unreadable beneath his dust-covered hat. "Sarah," Mrs. Collins said gently, placing a steadying hand on her arm. "Don't assume the worst. Wait and hear what the sheriff has to say." Sarah nodded mechanically, willing herself to remain calm as Mrs. Collins opened the door to the sheriff. Matthew, who had been playing with blocks in the corner, looked up with interest at the visitor. "Mrs. Jameson," Sheriff Ellis said, removing his hat. "Madam, where is he?" Sarah interrupted, unable to bear the suspense. "Where's Blake?" The sheriff's expression softened. "He's alive, Mrs. Jameson, but I'm afraid he's been injured. We caught up with Blackwell and his men at the old Miller place. There was a fight. Thompson took a bullet to the shoulder protecting young Deputy Williams." Sarah felt the room spin slightly. "How bad?" "Doc Simmons is with him now at his office. Said the bullet went clean through, no major damage, but he lost a fair amount of blood before we could get him back to town." Sarah was already reaching for her shawl. "Matthew, stay with Mrs. Collins. I need to go to Mr. Blake." Matthew's small face creased with worry. "Is Mr. Blake hurt bad, Ma?" Sarah forced a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart, he's going to be just fine. I'm just going to make sure he's comfortable. I'll be back soon." Sheriff Ellis insisted on escorting her to the doctor's office, filling her in on more details as they walked quickly through the town. "Thompson's a brave man, Mrs. Jameson. Possibly saved young Williams's life, and he was instrumental in capturing Blackwell, tracked him like he was born to it." "And the robbers?" Sarah asked, needing to know the threat was truly eliminated. "All 3 in custody," the sheriff confirmed. "They'll be transported to the territorial prison as soon as a proper escort can be arranged. They won't be troubling honest folk again for a long, long time." The doctor's office was a small building just off the main street. Inside, the waiting room was empty except for Deputy Williams, his arm in a sling and his young face pale with shock and fatigue. "Mrs. Jameson," he said, rising awkwardly as she entered. "Mr. Thompson's been asking for you. Doc's just finishing up with him." As if on cue, the inner door opened and Dr. Simmons emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "Ah, Mrs. Jameson. Good. Perhaps you can convince this stubborn patient of mine that he needs rest rather than trying to get up and ride back to your homestead." "He's awake," Sarah asked, relief flooding through her. "And ornery as a bear with a sore paw," the doctor confirmed with a hint of a smile. "Go on in. Maybe you can talk some sense into him." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She pushed past the doctor into the small examining room where Blake lay on a narrow table, his upper body bare except for the white bandage wrapped around his left shoulder. His face was pale beneath his tan, but his eyes were clear and alert as they found hers. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse but strong. "I'm sorry I worried you." She crossed to him in 3 quick steps, tears she'd been holding back finally spilling over as she saw for herself that he was truly alive. "Blake Thompson, if you ever frighten me like this again, I'll shoot me yourself," he suggested with a weak smile, reaching up with his good arm to brush away her tears. Sarah caught his hand and pressed it to her cheek. "Don't joke. When I saw the posse return without you." "I'm sorry," Blake repeated, more seriously this time. "But we got them, Sarah. Blackwell and his men won't hurt anyone else." Sarah leaned down to press her forehead against his. "I don't care about them. I care about you, you foolish, brave man. The doctor says you need rest." "What I need," Blake countered, "is to get back home with you and Matthew. We have a wedding to prepare for, remember?" Sarah straightened, fixing him with a stern look that was somewhat undermined by the tears still shining in her eyes. "The wedding can wait until you're properly healed. I'm not walking down the aisle to a man who might faint from blood loss before the vows are finished." Blake's laugh turned into a wince as it jarred his injured shoulder. "Fair enough, but I'm not staying in town. If I need to rest, I want to do it at home. Our home." Something in the way he said, "our home," melted Sarah's resolve. After consulting with Dr. Simmons, arrangements were made for Blake to be transported back to the homestead the following day, provided he rested comfortably through the night. Sarah returned to Mrs. Collins's house to reassure Matthew, who insisted on making a get-well card for Blake with Mrs. Collins's colored pencils. The next afternoon found Blake installed in the cabin's main bedroom. Sarah had insisted, despite his protests, with strict instructions to remain in bed for at least 3 days. Matthew appointed himself Blake's personal attendant, bringing water, books, and endless conversation whenever Sarah allowed him in the room. "He's going to wear you out," Sarah observed on the second day, finding Blake listening attentively to Matthew's detailed explanation of a bird's nest he discovered near the barn. "I don't mind," Blake replied after Matthew had been sent to wash up for dinner. "His company keeps me from going stir-crazy in this bed." Sarah sat on the edge of the mattress, carefully checking his bandage. The wound was healing clean, with no sign of the infection that was the greatest danger in such injuries. "You're lucky," she said softly. "The doctor said an inch to the right, and the bullet might have hit something vital." Blake caught her hand as she finished adjusting the bandage. "I made you a promise, Sarah. I intend to keep all my promises to you." The intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. Despite his injury, despite the pallor that still hadn't completely left his face, he was still the most handsome man she'd ever known, and now, indisputably, the bravest and most honorable as well. "I've been thinking," she said, allowing her fingers to intertwine with his. "Perhaps we don't need to wait until you're completely healed to get married. Reverend Simmons could come here, perform a simple ceremony with just Matthew and a few close neighbors as witnesses." Blake's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What about your new dress? The celebration you've been planning?" Sarah smiled, leaning closer to him. "I've realized something, Blake Thompson. The trappings don't matter. What matters is that we're together, you, me, and Matthew. The rest is just details." Blake's good arm came up to draw her closer still. "Are you sure?" "I don't want you to give up the wedding you deserve." "What I deserve," Sarah said softly, "is a good man who loves me and my son. I already have that. Why wait to make it official?" The kiss they shared sealed the decision. 3 days later, with Blake able to stand with only minimal discomfort, Reverend Simmons presided over a simple but heartfelt ceremony in the Jameson cabin. Matthew stood proudly at Blake's side, holding the simple gold band that Blake placed on Sarah's finger as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all the days of his life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Simmons declared, his smile wide beneath his gray beard. "Mr. Thompson, you may kiss your bride." Blake needed no further invitation. His kiss was tender but thorough, prompting a giggle from Matthew and appreciative applause from the handful of neighbors who had gathered to witness the union. That evening, after their guests had departed, and Matthew had finally been persuaded to go to sleep despite his excitement, Sarah and Blake sat together on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the spring sky. "Happy, Mrs. Thompson." Blake asked, his arm around her shoulders pulling her close against his side. Sarah looked up at him, at the face that had become dearer to her than she'd ever thought possible when he'd first appeared at her homestead. "More than I can say. Are you?" "Sarah," he said seriously, "the day I stopped to help you with that firewood was the luckiest day of my life. Every morning I wake up beside you, every time I see you smile or hear you laugh, every moment with you and Matthew, it's more than happiness. It's coming home." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, careful of his healing wound. "I love you, Blake Thompson." "And I love you, Sarah Thompson," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Always will." As night settled fully around them, wrapping the small homestead in its peaceful embrace, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of grief and loneliness to the unexpected joy of second chances, from a widow struggling alone to a woman whose heart had found its match in a cowboy who'd simply stopped to help carry her load. "Share your life with me," he'd said that first day, and now they had not just their daily work and responsibilities, but their dreams, their fears, their love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A family forged not by blood but by choice and commitment and the kind of love that comes once in a lifetime, if you're fortunate enough to recognize it when it appears. And Sarah Thompson, no longer a widow but a wife again, knew with absolute certainty that she was very fortunate indeed. Spring gave way to summer, and the Thompson homestead flourished under the combined efforts of Blake and Sarah. The vegetable garden yielded bountifully, the repaired fences kept the livestock secure, and the small orchard Thomas had planted years before produced its first real harvest of apples and pears. Blake built additional shelves in the root cellar to accommodate their growing stores, while Sarah put up preserves and dried fruits for the winter ahead. Matthew thrived in the secure environment of their blended family. He started attending the town school in September, riding in with Blake 3 days a week and staying with Mrs. Collins, who had become like a grandmother to him. His natural intelligence, nurtured by both Sarah's patient teaching and Blake's practical knowledge, made him a standout pupil despite his young age. "Teacher says I'm the best reader in my class," Matthew announced proudly one evening in late October as they sat around the dinner table. "Said I might skip ahead to the next level after Christmas." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Sarah said, exchanging a proud smile with Blake. "But remember what we talked about, learning isn't a race." "Your mother's right," Blake added, passing Matthew another helping of stew. "Understanding what you read is more important than how fast you can do it." Matthew nodded seriously. "I know. But Billy Jenkins said his pa told him that book learning is useless out here, that I should focus on learning to shoot and ride instead." Blake set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. "Well now, that's interesting. Tell me, Matthew, when we're figuring how much seed we need for spring planting, or calculating how much wood to cut for winter, or measuring lumber for a new hen house, what are we using?" Matthew considered this. "Numbers, mathematics." "That's right," Blake confirmed. "And when I'm reading about new farming methods in those journals from back east, or your mother is following a recipe, or we're writing letters to order supplies, we need rating," Matthew concluded, his young face brightening with understanding. "So book learning is useful." "Essential," Blake corrected with a wink. "A man needs both kinds of education to thrive out here, books and practical skills. You're getting both, which puts you ahead of Billy Jenkins already." Sarah watched the exchange with a heart full of gratitude. Blake had taken to fatherhood as naturally as if he'd been preparing for it his whole life. He was patient but firm, encouraging but realistic, and he seemed to instinctively understand when Matthew needed guidance and when he needed simply to find his own way. Later that night, after Matthew was asleep, Sarah and Blake sat by the fire going over their accounts, a monthly ritual that helped them plan for the future. If the cattle prices hold through spring, we might be able to add that second field to our planting, Blake observed, running a finger down the neat column of figures Sarah had recorded. And maybe hire some help for the harvest next year. Sarah nodded, making a note in the margin. The extra income from my sewing has helped too. Mrs. Peterson says the women in town are asking who made her new dress. Blake looked up from the ledger, his face soft in the firelight. You're building quite a reputation as a seamstress. I'm proud of you. We're building something together, Sarah corrected, reaching across to take his hand. Something lasting. Blake brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her palm. That we are, Mrs. Thompson. The tender moment was interrupted by an unexpected knock at the door. Blake rose immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle kept near the fireplace. Late visitors were unusual, especially as winter approached and travel became more difficult. "Who's there?" he called, positioning himself between the door and where Sarah sat. "Blake, it's Will Ellis. Sorry to disturb you folks so late." Blake relaxed slightly at the sheriff's voice, though his expression remained alert as he opened the door. Sheriff Ellis stood on the porch, his coat dusted with the first snow of the season that had begun falling earlier that evening. "Will," Blake greeted him, stepping back to allow the man entry. "Come in out of the cold. Is everything all right?" "Evening, Sarah," the sheriff said, nodding respectfully as he removed his hat. "Sorry about the hour. I was passing nearby on my way back from the Henderson place and saw your light still burning." Sarah rose to stoke the fire. "Can I offer you coffee, Sheriff? Or something stronger to ward off the chill?" "Coffee would be mighty welcome, thank you," Ellis replied, settling into the chair Blake indicated. As Sarah busied herself with the pot, Blake studied the sheriff's face. "What brings you out to the Henderson place in this weather?" Ellis sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Bad business, I'm afraid. Old man Henderson passed 2 days ago. Heart just gave out, according to Doc Simmons. His daughter from back east is arriving next week to settle his affairs, but in the meantime, I'm keeping an eye on the property." "That's sad news," Sarah said, returning with coffee for their visitor. "Mr. Henderson was a good neighbor, though we didn't see much of him these past months." "He kept to himself," Ellis agreed, warming his hands around the cup. "But that's not the only reason I stopped. Thought you should know that Curtis Blackwell escaped during prisoner transfer 3 weeks ago." Blake's posture stiffened immediately. "Escaped? How?" "Overpowered a guard when they stopped to water the horses," Ellis explained grimly. "Killed the man and disappeared into the hills. Territorial marshals have been searching, but no sign of him yet." Sarah felt a cold that had nothing to do with the snow outside. "Do you think he'd come back here, after all this time?" Ellis's expression was grave. "Blackwell made threats during his time in custody, specifically mentioned the men responsible for his capture. Your name came up more than once, Blake." Blake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I appreciate the warning, Will. We'll keep a sharp eye out." "I've increased patrols in the area," Ellis continued, "and spread the word to all the outlying homesteads. But I'd feel better if you folks took extra precautions for a while." "We will," Blake assured him, his hand finding Sarah's in a gesture of support. "Sarah's a fair shot now, and I don't stray far from the property these days." After the sheriff departed, declining their offer to stay the night due to his need to return to town, Sarah began preparing for bed with mechanical movements that betrayed her distress. Blake secured the doors and windows with particular care before joining her in their bedroom. "He won't come here," Blake said with more confidence than he felt, drawing Sarah into his arms. "Blackwell's likely halfway to Mexico by now, if he has any sense." Sarah rested her head against his chest, taking comfort in the steady beat of his heart. "But if he doesn't have sense, If he's seeking revenge, Blake lifted her chin gently, meeting her worried gaze. Then he'll find I'm not an easy target. I protected what's mine once before. I'll do it again if necessary. The quiet determination in his voice reassured Sarah somewhat, though she still found sleep elusive that night. As she lay awake listening to Blake's steady breathing beside her, she reflected on how quickly happiness could be threatened in this harsh land. Yet the very difficulties that tested them had also forged their bond stronger now than she could have imagined possible when Blake first appeared at her homestead. The following weeks passed without incident, though Blake insisted on certain precautions that became part of their daily routine. Matthew was no longer allowed to play outdoors alone. The doors remained locked even during daylight hours. Blake taught Sarah how to use the signal mirror he placed in the barn loft, which could alert their nearest neighbors in case of trouble. As November progressed and Thanksgiving approached, the initial fear began to recede somewhat. No further news of Blackwell reached them, and the increasing snowfall made travel difficult for everyone, outlaws included. They began preparations for the holiday, planning to host several neighboring families for a communal feast, the first real entertaining they'd done since their marriage. "We should invite Mrs. Collins to stay with us for the celebration," Sarah suggested as she and Blake worked together one evening, preparing the cabin for their guests. Matthew would love having her here, and the journey back to town might be difficult if the weather turns. Blake nodded, hanging fresh garlands of pine Sarah had woven to brighten the main room. Good idea. The small room off the kitchen would suit her well enough for a few days' stay. Sarah paused in her work, studying her husband as he stretched to secure the garland. The bullet wound in his shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar as evidence of his brush with death. In the months since their marriage, Blake had filled out somewhat, the regular meals, and decreased wandering, adding a healthy weight to his formerly lean frame. His face, once watchful and guarded, now more often wore expressions of contentment and quiet joy. "What?" Blake asked, catching her gaze. "Do I have pine sap on my face?" Sarah smiled, crossing to him and rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his lips. "No. I was just thinking how right you look here, as if you've always belonged." Blake's arms came around her waist, drawing her closer. "I have always belonged here, Sarah. I just didn't know it until I found you." The tenderness of the moment was broken by Matthew's excited voice as he burst into the room, clutching a slate covered with careful drawings. "Pa, Ma, look what I made for Thanksgiving. It's a map showing where all our food comes from." Blake released Sarah to crouch beside Matthew, examining the boy's work with genuine interest. Sarah watched them, her heart full at hearing Matthew so naturally call Blake Pa, a development that had occurred gradually over the summer and now seemed as normal as breathing. The day before Thanksgiving brought heavy snow, but also welcome visitors. Mrs. Collins arrived in the company of Reverend Simmons, who was making rounds to his more distant parishioners before the winter made travel prohibitive. They brought news from town and gifts for Matthew, a new book of adventure stories from Mrs. Collins, and a hand-carved wooden whistle from the Reverend. "The place looks wonderful," Mrs. Collins declared as she helped Sarah prepare vegetables for the next day's feast. "And Matthew is positively thriving. Marriage clearly agrees with you, my dear." Sarah smiled, glancing through the window where Blake and Matthew could be seen building a snow fort, their laughter visible in puffs of condensed breath. "It does. Blake has been more than I could have hoped for." "God works in mysterious ways," Mrs. Collins observed with gentle wisdom. "When Thomas was taken, you must have thought your happiness was ended, yet here you are, blessed with a second chance at love." "I think about that often," Sarah admitted. "How something as simple as needing help with firewood led to all of this." "Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the smallest steps," Mrs. Collins said, patting Sarah's hand. Now, shall we start on the pies? I brought extra cinnamon from my pantry, impossible to find in the general store these days. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was filled with the delicious aromas of roasting turkey, baking bread, and Sarah's special apple pies. The first guests arrived just as Blake was carving the bird the Peterson family from the neighboring homestead, followed shortly by the Wilsons and their 3 children. The meal was a joyous affair, the table extended with boards to accommodate everyone. Blake sat at the head, his face alight with pride as he surveyed the feast Sarah had prepared, and the gathered community that had accepted him so completely. When Reverend Simmons asked him to offer the blessing, Blake's voice was steady but emotional as he gave thanks for the bounty before them, and the bonds of friendship and family that sustained them all. As the evening progressed with music, stories, and games for the children, Sarah found herself watching Blake across the room. He was teaching the younger Wilson boys how to play a simple card game, his patience evident as he explained the rules repeatedly to the excited children. Catching her gaze, he smiled a private communication amid the bustling celebration that spoke of shared joy and silent understanding. Later, after their guests had departed and Mrs. Collins had retired to her room, Sarah and Blake stood together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the cold as they admired the stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. "Thank you," Blake said softly, his arm around Sarah's waist holding her close. "For what? For this day. For welcoming me into your life, for making me a father to Matthew." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I've never known happiness like this, Sarah. Never imagined it was possible." Sarah reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the beloved contours. "Nor I, after Thomas died. You gave me back something I thought was lost forever." Their kiss was slow and deep, a reaffirmation of the love that had grown between them through the changing seasons of their first year together. When they finally parted, Blake kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Was going to wait for Christmas, but tonight seems right." He pressed a small object into her hand. Opening her palm, Sarah found a delicate silver charm in the shape of a pine tree. "It's beautiful," she said, turning it to catch the moonlight. "For your locket," Blake explained. "I thought. Well, the pine represents strength, endurance, like our family." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of his gift. "Help me put it in." Blake's fingers were surprisingly deft as he opened the locket that still hung around her neck, carefully adding the charm alongside the miniature portrait of Matthew. "There," he said softly. "Perfect." As they stood together in the quiet night, surrounded by the wilderness that had both tested and blessed them, Sarah felt a contentment deeper than any she'd known. From widow to wife, from solitary struggle to shared strength, her journey had been unexpected but ultimately miraculous. "Come inside," she whispered, taking Blake's hand. "It's too cold to stay out here." "Wherever you go, I follow," Blake replied simply, allowing her to lead him back into the warmth of their home, the home they had built together from grief and chance and courage, and most of all, from love that had begun with a simple offer to share a burden and had grown to encompass an entire life. As winter settled fully over the Montana territory, the Thompson homestead stood as a beacon of warmth and hope, proof that even in the harshest landscapes, happiness could take root and flourish, given the right care and the right companions for the journey.